During a cold night in a small village bathed in moonlight, accompanied by the sounds of insects all around, not far from there, a man was lying directly on the ground. He had just received notifications from some kind of blue-colored interface that looked like a system UI. He had just been given the right to make a random wish. Then he was now one of the main characters of the novel, the Iron and Blood Knight. And finally, he was required to be brave and surpass himself. The Iron and Blood Knight? That's the same novel he was reading last night, yet everything feels so real to the touch. And what wish were they talking about? And why did he have to surpass himself? He had just realized something because all of this looked exactly like the isekai stories in web novels. He wondered if he had really ended up in the body of someone else in another world. Not far behind him were several houses, so why was he lying on the muddy road, and in the middle of the night? He slowly started getting up, shivering all over from the cold. Because of that, he couldn't even speak properly. He was trembling too much. An emergency notification appeared, mocking him for sleeping outside. Annoyed, he tried to make the notification disappear with his hand because he already knew. He then understood that he had become a character in the novel. But who exactly had he reincarnated as? Because who could live in the countryside and fall asleep like that on the ground? But a voice addressing him as Master Lloyd pulled him out of his thoughts. As he turned around slowly, he was shocked by what he saw. A sword hanging from the person's waist. Silver white hair. There was no doubt, standing before him was the main character of the Iron and Blood Knight, Javier Asrahan. Javier told him he should return to the residence because it was getting late, but our protagonist was shocked because Javier had just called him Lloyd. And based on what he knew, Javier would later become an incredibly powerful swordsman throughout the story. He would even become famous across the entire continent, but for now he was just a nameless knight working in the countryside for his lord, Arcos Frontera. Our protagonist suddenly realized something important. He had reincarnated as Lloyd Frontera, the worst possible character in the novel. A heavy silence settled between the two men, because while our protagonist was upset, Javier had no idea why he was reacting like that. Javier said he had only called him, he hadn't insulted him at all. Seeing this, he thought Lloyd was fine, since it proved he was fully conscious. A few minutes later, once they arrived back at the Frontera estate, Lloyd was relighting the fire. He didn't understand how Lloyd could say he didn't know how he ended up out there, because apparently he had drunk way too much alcohol, and since he couldn't control himself, he had caused a mess at the bar. Then, on his way home, he collapsed in the street. But our protagonist was a bit ashamed of such behavior. His father had even sent someone to look for him because he hadn't returned, because even if he was a delinquent, his father couldn't leave him lying outside. But while Javier spoke, our protagonist was thinking about something else. He placed his hand on the floor, wondering if the house didn't have an ondo, floor heating. Javier told him he would let him rest now, and that tomorrow morning he would report what happened to his father. Was he really obligated to do that? Javier answered yes. As Javier was about to leave, Lloyd stopped him, asking if it was true that his family was drowning in debt. But Javier replied by asking if that topic was really necessary right now. Then he left the room, leaving our protagonist alone. He thought to himself that he already knew what would happen in the novel. Last night, before being transported here, he had read the last episode of the novel while lying in his tiny studio. He also knew what would become of Lloyd, because Arcos Frontera, Lloyd's father, would kill himself along with his wife after being swindled by a close relative. Then, Lloyd would become an alcoholic beggar, before being poisoned and dying as well. Suddenly sitting up in bed, our protagonist wondered what the point of being noble was here, since his life wasn't very different from the real world. He remembered the notification he had received, telling him he could make a wish. And who was this absolute that put him in someone else's body? The sun was rising over the green lands of the Frontera domain. Meanwhile, in the Frontera family residence, a beautiful blonde woman accompanied by Javier asked if it was true that our protagonist had broken things at the bar. Her name was Marbella Frantera, and in this world, she was the mother of our protagonist, now called Lloyd. But being falsely accused for someone else's actions, he thought to himself that last night he had been in his bed before being transported here. Seeing that he wasn't responding, she begged him to at least apologize to the bartender, just this once. Inside, he thought he had no choice. He had to play the role of Lloyd. So he told her he would apologize to the man. Javier didn't believe it, since such words were foreign to Lloyd. His mother was surprised too. A few minutes later in the village, a man was sweeping in front of his house, placing dry herbs on a cart. He was interrupted by footsteps approaching. It was our protagonist and Javier beside him. When the man saw them, he immediately hid behind this cart. Lloyd didn't really understand why people reacted like that when they saw him. As they walked down the street, everyone who saw them coming ran away instantly, at full speed. Lloyd then noticed something. A little boy watching from a window, but his mother quickly grabbed him and closed the window. But our protagonist wanted to know why Javier was always behind him. Javier said he was supposed to watch him in case he caused trouble again. He wondered if Javier was protecting him, but Javier said he was actually protecting the villagers from him. Hearing this, our protagonist thought he had to change Lloyd's delinquent image, otherwise he wouldn't get help from the villagers when his family fell. He thought he might prevent that fall if he managed to pay all his family's debts. Then he could have a peaceful and bright future. He wondered if he had any skills he could use with the system, but he had only two. Delinquent, a skill that annoys others. Drunkard, a skill that makes him stupid. He was upset that such traits were even called skills. Javier didn't understand why Lloyd was moving around strangely. He asked where exactly Lloyd was going in that direction, but Lloyd didn't really understand the question. Javier wanted to know if he was lying again about apologizing because the bar's door was right here. But Lloyd said he was just lost in his thoughts. Irritated, Javier stared at him. But Lloyd wondered why he was looking at him like that. Javier replied that it was nothing, he should just go in. As our protagonist opened the bar door, Javier wondered what had happened to him since last night because his behavior had changed as if he were someone else. Broken tables, broken chairs, shattered decorations. That's what the bar looked like after Lloyd's actions the previous night. Lloyd sat down and sincerely apologized to the bar owner, admitting it was all his fault. Javier didn't know whether he was serious or pretending again. Just seeing Lloyd terrified the owner. He didn't know what to do. He begged Lloyd not to cause trouble again since he had destroyed almost everything last time. But Lloyd said he recognized his wrongs from the previous night. Terrified, the owner said he didn't need to apologize, it was already in the past. But seeing this, our protagonist felt uncomfortable. Even his apology wasn't being taken seriously. A few minutes later, he didn't understand why the man still didn't believe his apology. Javier told him it was normal. He had destroyed almost everything in the bar. It was normal for the owner not to accept his apology without compensation. But our protagonist thought it was impossible to compensate him now, since his family also had debts. Javier added that the bar owner's mother was sick from the winter cold, and because of Lloyd's mess, things were even harder for the man. And indeed, our protagonist had also noticed the cold inside the bar. A simple fireplace wasn't enough. As they were walking, he suddenly stopped. He felt something forming in his mind, little by little. As he tried to concentrate, an idea suddenly appeared in his head. A plan began forming, point by point, line by line, until it fully materialized in his mind. A complete Ondol blueprint had formed. He thought that in this world, no one knew about Ondol, and if he could build one during this winter cold, everyone would want one. He had reincarnated into the body of Lloyd, a delinquent incapable of doing this. But the real him, Kim Soo-ho, could do it using this body. Because in college, he studied civil engineering. He had also built a house completely on his own during military service, and he had construction site experience because he worked day and night there. It was finally time to take control of the situation and pay off all his father's and family's debts. He immediately turned around and told Javier they had to go back to the bar right now. But Javier didn't understand why. He had just left the bar. What was he going back for? But our protagonist told him it was time to make his first request. At that moment, the system activated. He could now earn relationship points by improving his relations with the citizens. And for now, his points were at 0. But our protagonist was shocked to see such a system notification appear right after making that decision. After a long observation, he still couldn't understand what these relationship points meant, because despite the several notifications he had just received, no manual had been given to him about how to use these points. Turning toward Javier, he wondered internally if, as the system had just announced, he could also gain relationship points by improving his relationship with Javier. Looking at him more closely, he noticed a notification above his head saying that his sympathy level toward him was at -30. Seeing how low that was, he finally decided to try increasing those points by pointing out to Javier that he looked very handsome today. But Javier told him that he already knew he was handsome, so there was no need to remind him. His sympathy level dropped again to -31. Seeing that, our protagonist decided to leave, afraid of making the situation even worse. Javier, who stayed behind, really didn't understand what was going on with Lloyd. A few minutes later, once he arrived at the bar, holding a work contract in his hand, our protagonist told the bar owner that he was the builder and the owner was the client, because he would pay all construction costs to compensate for the mess he had recently caused in the bar. He then told him to sign to confirm the contract. The man simply looked at him without saying anything, because he couldn't trust him, especially with a work contract on top of that. Our protagonist then realized that everyone was wary of Lloyd because he truly wasn't an honest guy after all. Deep down, he told himself he couldn't mess up this chance to get his first client, or else his plan would fall apart. He then told the owner that they would be seeing each other more often, so he should rather trust him, don't you think? Immediately, the frightened man began signing the contract as quickly as possible. The system then told him that he was acting like a piece of trash. After retrieving the contract, he told himself he didn't care if he was trash because he had just gotten his first contract. He then told the owner he had made a very good choice and wouldn't regret it. But Javier, who had witnessed the whole scene, wondered why he had to act like a delinquent every single time. A few minutes later outside, behind the bar, our protagonist was standing there with a shovel in hand. He said that the construction would be modest, so it wasn't necessary to measure the land. But his thoughts were interrupted by Javier calling out to him. Javier told him that he had just forced the bar owner to sign the contract, and asked whether this was a new way for him to cause trouble. But Lloyd stayed silent for a moment, simply staring at him. Then he asked Javier if he knew what cognitive distortion was, but he really didn't understand what he was talking about. Lloyd explained that it's when someone assumes a person's actions will remain the same as in the past because of certain prejudices and negative judgments toward them. Javier replied that he wasn't basing it on simple prejudices, but on his experience and statistics. Lloyd then asked whether those statistics and that experience didn't also come from the past. Surprised, Javier wondered internally since when Lloyd could defend himself verbally so well. While beginning to dig at the same time, Lloyd told Javier he would bring a smile back to the bar owner with this construction, because if he succeeded, this first project would bring him many more contracts. Our protagonist then started digging the ground with his shovel, while Javier stayed behind watching his every move. After some time, the construction began to take shape, as the whole structure would be made mostly from solid wood. After that step, he covered the walls with yellow clay he had found in the lake right beside them, but he also seemed really exhausted. Lying on the ground, he told himself that Lloyd's body was physically very weak. Javier approached him, saying that the construction was really fast, but Lloyd told him that it had taken him more than a week to do all that, and he was calling that fast? Internally, Javier wondered if he would really keep his promise to the bar owner, because the Lloyd from Terra he knew could never build something like this. He wondered where he had even learned this type of construction. Meanwhile, our protagonist was out of breath, hurting everywhere, and the constitution of his body really wasn't helping him. But deep down, he didn't have time to rest because even trembling, he told himself he had to keep going. As he was about to cut the piece of wood in front of him, a hand suddenly stopped him mid-motion. Turning around immediately, he was surprised to see Javier behind him, supporting his body. He took the axe from his hands and asked what he needed to do to help him. Lloyd told him he needed him to cut the wood precisely to that size. Very focused, Javier began throwing the wooden pieces into the air, preparing his axe at high speed. He started cutting every piece with precision as they fell. When they hit the ground, every wooden piece was perfectly cut, all the same size. Lloyd was shocked. He could only praise Javier for his impressive performance. Because in the novel, he was supposed to become a great sword master, it made perfect sense that he was this strong. Approaching him, Lloyd also asked if he could help dig the ground with him so they could progress faster. Annoyed, Javier wondered if he had really just given him more work instead of simply saying thank you. But Lloyd told him that he was probably curious to know whether he would scam them or actually do the job, right? So for that, they had no choice. They had to work together if they wanted the construction to progress quickly. But Javier agreed in his mind because Lloyd had really changed these last few days. He had to help him and see where all of this was going. The two men started digging the ground inside the house with precise measurements. Lloyd and Javier, deeply focused, progressed faster thanks to their combined effort. After working hard for several days, the construction was finally completed. While our protagonist was proud of his work, Javier asked what that piece of wood above the front door was, but Lloyd told him it was his signature mark. He would understand later what it was really used for. He then told Javier they should now go check the inside of the construction and see how he planned to scam the bar owner. Feeling a bit targeted by his words, Javier could only accept. A few minutes later in the evening, firewood was burning outside in the fireplace. It was the house our protagonist had just built, and inside, an old lady lying on the ground couldn't believe it. It was so warm. The bar owner was also shocked to see such a construction. Javier and Lloyd stood there watching their clients marvel at the creation. The woman was truly delighted because despite the cold outside, everything was so warm inside. The owner still couldn't believe it, wondering how any of this was possible, how such a construction could even exist. Our protagonist told himself that it was the first time the people of this world had seen such a type of construction, because once the underground floor is heated, it feels like pure magic because of the effect it creates. The bar owner could only thank him because his mother hadn't smiled that much in a long time. Javier in the back couldn't believe it because everything was happening exactly as Lloyd had predicted earlier. Even the way he spoke and his expression had changed in just one morning. He wondered internally if his true goal was really to make them happy, because the Lloyd Frontera he knew would never do something like this. But seeing the bar owner and his mother so happy thanks to this construction, Javier could only smile at such a scene. The system informed our protagonist that Javier's sympathy level toward him had increased by 2 points. It had now gone from -31 to -29. He had also earned 36 relationship points after helping the bar owner. He could only smile at all these notifications. He then turned toward Javier and asked if he didn't find him impressive by any chance. But Javier told him no, he could never think such a thing. But our protagonist told himself internally that he had already taken the first step after all. Even if he had used wood he bought himself, that wasn't a problem, because this house was only meant to advertise what he would build next. A few days later, several villagers came to visit the house. A man walking out said it was so hot he felt like melting. Others wondered if it was really that warm inside. Our protagonist told them it was impressive, wasn't it? And asked if they wanted the same type of house for themselves. He currently had 2 construction models. The first model was a small house in the yard. The second was a remodeling of their current house's floor. And if they signed for both, they'd receive a 10% discount on all construction fees. But the man seemed hesitant because he didn't really trust him. But our protagonist told him they would be seeing each other more often, so they should rather trust each other mutually. While they were talking, footsteps seemed to get closer. Our protagonist noticed it. The man in front of him asked what he was doing this time. This was the father of our protagonist in this world, Arcos Frontera, and his sympathy level toward Lloyd was -20. Seeing that, our protagonist was a bit surprised by the situation, not knowing what to answer at that moment. After that, later on in the Frontera family's manor, Lloyd was now sitting at the table sharing a meal with his father. He was thinking that he had managed to avoid his father until now, and he didn't even know if his father was going to tell him to stop working or not. His father broke the silence by asking him to talk a little, because he was still wondering what Lloyd was plotting this time. Lloyd simply told him that he had received an order from the tavern manager and had just finished it. His father wanted to know if it was the same with the other villagers as well. Lloyd told him that it was exactly the case, because it seemed like his father already knew a lot about the situation. His father told him it was unacceptable to scam the villagers because they meant a lot to their family. Lloyd told him not to worry, because that wasn't his intention at all. After finishing his meal, he told his father that if that was all he wanted to say, he would now take his leave. But his father wanted to know if he was doing all this because of the difficult period their family was going through. Lloyd told him not to worry, because he could handle this kind of thing very well. What his father should do, however, was simply not add more problems on top of everything. As Lloyd watched him, he thought to himself that he had already heard those words once before. It was exactly what his father in his previous world used to tell him, before he was reincarnated here. But he already knew that what he had just told his father wasn't true, because he knew very well that nothing was going well. He told his father not to give up, because he too would do his best to help him. Inside, he thought that this was exactly what he should have told his father in his previous world, but sadly, he never did. As he walked through the hallway, lost in thought about all the orders they had received, something interrupted him. Two men were walking toward him. They were two loan sharks known throughout the empire. One was named Mitloff and the other Shiloh. Both men walked past him without even greeting him. He wondered why they were here today and why they were acting that way. After that, inside Baron Frantera's office, one of the men asked why the Baron kept postponing the payment date instead of paying them already. The 5-day extension they had granted him had already passed, and they still hadn't received anything. He told the Baron that if he kept delaying the payment, they would have to seize some of his property. One of the men added that the suggestion was good. Selling some furniture would help him repay part of the debt. Lloyd was watching everything from the back, thinking that the timing of these two men was perfect for him. They were right on time. He remembered how the system had told him earlier that he had 36 relationship points. He assumed he had earned those points after Javier's sympathy toward him increased, but how was he supposed to use them? The system then informed him that he could gain skills using his relationship points. The system was now loading. A glowing circle appeared under his feet. Surprised, he watched as the system scanned his existing knowledge. Soil mechanism knowledge, hydrography knowledge, structural dynamics knowledge, potable and wastewater pipeline engineering, construction with steel and concrete frameworks, advanced programming and design levels. The system told him he was more intelligent than he appeared. Annoyed, his response was that he already knew that. He had earned a scholarship for it. A new notification appeared showing the skills he could upgrade. 15 points for fundamental measurement, 20 points for fundamental design. Lloyd still didn't understand what these skills meant, but since he had 36 points and both skills required exactly 35 points combined, he decided to upgrade them both at once to see the result. His eyes suddenly lit up. That was the fundamental measurement skill activating. Opening his window quickly, he wondered what he could now see with this new glow in his eyes. He was surprised. He could now create a 3D illustration of the ground without any equipment. And with the fundamental design skill, creating plans was now much easier than drawing them by hand. After that, sitting on his bed, he told himself everything was going to be easier now. But could he still rely on Javier's help like earlier? It would be even easier if he had heavy equipment. At that moment, the system notified him that there was a possibility to summon things through invocation. He was startled by the message. Another notification told him that he could obtain fantastical creatures using his relationship points, a variety of creatures and abilities, but summoning required 50 points. Seeing this, Lloyd felt irritated. After spending almost all his points earlier, he only had 1 point left out of the 36, so he couldn't summon anything. He wondered if these fantastical creatures would be unicorns, monsters, or dragons, and whether such creatures would even be useful for what he needed to do. He told himself he had to gain more sympathy from the people around him to earn more points. A hand slammed onto the table. It was the loan shark telling the Baron that if he didn't have money, he had another solution. He suggested selling his wife and most of his servants for a good price to quickly repay the debt. What do you think? The Baron was visibly furious hearing such things about his wife and his workers. A voice echoed behind him, saying that being a loan shark didn't mean being rude. Lloyd had just entered the room, staring at the man without any expression. The man immediately asked who he was to interfere in their discussion. His father was shocked to see him interrupt this conversation. The loan shark then understood that he was the Baron's son, the one with a terrible reputation everywhere. But Lloyd told him that instead of making noise for nothing, he should show his intention. The two loan sharks didn't understand what he meant. What intention? According to Clause 6 of Article 3 of the Kingdom's Noble Law, all nobles could exercise their right to protect their interests as vassals of the king, and coming here without an invitation was considered trespassing. But they didn't believe him. It was the first time they heard of such a law. Lloyd told them that if they had really forgotten, he would remind them right now. He called out to Javier, "Enter." The door opened and Javier stood at the entrance, his weapon hanging at his waist. Lloyd told him to cut off both men's arms. As Javier walked toward them, he wondered if Lloyd had gone insane. If anything happened to them, they would file a complaint. But Lloyd told them they would see who was right before the king. Seeing Javier draw his sword with determination, the two men panicked, wondering if he really intended to cut their arms. Terrified, they ran away, saying that solving things this way wouldn't fix anything, and that Lloyd would regret it. They slammed the door as they fled. Lloyd muttered that they were all just pathetic for running away like that. His father called both of them. He asked what this behavior meant. Those men shouldn't be angered. But Lloyd placed a bag on the table, immediately silencing the room. He told his father that inside were the earnings he had received from the construction work he had already completed, and that he could repay part of this month's debt, interest included. His father asked if this was villagers' money, because it wouldn't be right to extort the people. But Javier told him not to worry. He would personally watch Lloyd to make sure he fulfilled his promises to the end. Hearing this from Javier, the Baron felt he could perhaps trust him this time. Lloyd said he would now take his leave and let him work in peace. As Javier and Lloyd walked through the hall, Javier told him he didn't know Lloyd had started studying noble laws like that. Lloyd said he had heard it somewhere and just remembered. In truth, he had learned that law from reading the novel, because Javier mentioned it after the Baron and his wife committed suicide. When the loan sharks came to dig up their corpses to sell them to repay the debt. That was when Javier mentioned this law for the first time, just before killing the two men. And after being taken to trial, he was found not guilty thanks to that law. Lloyd told himself that knowing the whole story of the novel helped him a lot in this world. He thought it was time for the system to show a new message. Right at that moment, notifications appeared. He had gained 6 points after improving his relationship with the Baron. He gained 60 skill points. His total was now 61. Exactly as he planned, now he could summon his first creature. Once night had fallen, Lloyd had gone outside to the backyard of the property. He started checking left and right to make sure no one was around, wanting to be absolutely certain that nobody was watching him. He had just asked the system to begin the draw. After clicking on Start, a light began to appear in front of him. 3 wheel-shaped forms spun above him. They also started forming a magic circle. He wondered inwardly if this was what a real magic circle looked like, but unfortunately, the inscriptions weren't very pretty, and not only were they small, but they also made a lot of noise. The magic circle began to warp for a moment, and a small hamster appeared. Lloyd was really disappointed to see what had actually come out of the circle. The little hamster fell to the ground and looked at him with a very cheerful expression. But our protagonist didn't react, staring at it without saying a single word. He suddenly said that the summoning was a huge failure. Hearing this, the little animal's eyes filled with tears. As Lloyd turned around to leave, the little animal started flailing behind him. Surprised by this reaction, he asked him if he could do something if he wasn't a failure. Turning back around, Lloyd told him to show what he could do and how he could possibly be useful to him. The little animal began chewing something in its mouth, then spit out pieces of paper. Picking them up, Lloyd thought it was really disgusting, but written on those pieces of paper were Podong's manuals. Podong was the name of the little hamster in front of him, and Lloyd was supposed to take good care of him. When he gave him one of the sunflower seeds inside the envelope, the hamster could transform and change size. The red seed allowed Podong to become extremely large for 12 hours. The blue seed made Podong shrink back, and Lloyd had to give it to him after 12 hours. And if the seeds ran out, a set of seeds alone counted as one relationship point. Lloyd then asked him if he could grow to the size of a man. Anyway, he told himself he would check it himself. He handed Podong the red seed. Once Podong chewed it, a blinding light appeared in front of him. It hit Lloyd right in the face and sent him flying several meters backward. When he lifted his head, he was shocked by what he saw, because Podong had not only grown, he was gigantic. Lloyd wondered if he was now 10 meters tall just from eating that seed. Proud of his performance, Podong looked down at him, certainly asking what Lloyd thought of him now. A system notification informed him that the skill digging the ground was now level 1. The skill reinforcing the ground was also level 1. And finally, the skill jaw was also level 1. Seeing this, Lloyd was very happy because he had just obtained something that could replace heavy equipment. Once he went back inside, he wondered how he would make his magical creature appear without the people around him getting suspicious. But he told himself he didn't need to worry, since he walked around with a book all the time these days. He would just make them believe he learned it from there. Very enthusiastic, he said it was time to find workers who would help him with the construction work. The next morning, very early, Lloyd was now standing with a shovel in hand in front of around 30 soldiers. He told them to repeat after him that safety was their priority, but the soldiers didn't really understand why they were supposed to say that, and some were still half asleep. Seeing this, Lloyd thought these soldiers were truly useless, yet despite all the debts, the Baron continued to keep them around. He thought it wasn't a problem, because thanks to him they would work for free, under his command. He began giving his speech, telling them they were here to work today. Pointing at the yellow dirt in front of them, he told them it was all the work he had done alone during the night. But deep down, he knew that Podong had done it in less than 30 minutes. He told them it was an on-doll project for the villagers, and that everyone present had to move all this dirt to the construction site. But the soldiers weren't very enthusiastic hearing that. Our protagonist thought to himself that he had already expected such a reaction from them. At that moment, a voice called out to him from behind. The man wanted to know what he was asking the soldiers to do. This man was one of the high-ranking knights, and his name was Neumann. But our protagonist already knew inside that this man would come to him sooner or later. Because in this domain, there were 3 knights, Neumann, then Bayern, and finally Javier Azrahan, the main character of the novel. But at the beginning of the novel, when the territory collapses, Javier and Bayern stay by Baron Frontera's side. But this man betrays the Frontera family and flees, because from the very beginning, he was the one who sold the Baron's information to scammers, which led to several deaths. Lloyd thought that someone like that shouldn't even be called a knight. He told him to imagine what he was doing, but Neumann told him it was unacceptable for him to see the soldiers under his command getting dirty like this. But Lloyd thought inwardly that he was only saying that because he knew he would earn money by making the soldiers work, and he could cover the debts. Lloyd told him he had received permission directly from his father. But Neumann wasn't happy with this idea, because he couldn't use soldiers to satisfy personal needs in that way. But Lloyd told him he was absolutely right, and that's why, if he continued, Lloyd would hit him for that. Neumann was furious after hearing that. And that wasn't all. After stabbing his shovel into the ground, Lloyd threw sand right into his face. All the soldiers were speechless at what they had just witnessed. They wondered if he had really thrown sand at Neumann. Neumann stood still for a moment without saying anything. Enraged, he demanded to know how Lloyd dared disrespect a knight of his rank. But Lloyd told him he hadn't heard well. Was he willing to set aside their titles and fight in a duel? After spinning his shovel, Lloyd pointed it at him and said he accepted his duel request. But Newman told him he would bitterly regret making that choice. A few minutes later, inside the manor, Javier was asking for confirmation. Was Lloyd really going to fight Newman in a duel exactly 1 month from now? And was he even sure of his decision? Did he have any chance of winning against him? But he told him that he had never said he had any chance of beating Newman. On top of that, Newman was a lower grade sword expert who could use mana. He should stop asking such stupid questions. Hearing that, Javier was extremely angry, to the point where he even wanted to draw his sword, but he quickly managed to calm himself down and let it go. Looking at our protagonist, Javier thought to himself that for a moment, he almost believed he had gone back to being the bandit he once was. But it seemed Lloyd had already calculated everything, because he had waited for him to leave with the Baron before going to confront Newman. But Lloyd interrupted his thoughts, telling him he had something to ask. He wanted Javier to teach him how to handle a sword, but Javier immediately said it was out of the question. Lloyd wanted to know why he refused his request. Javier answered that his role was to watch over him, not to train him in swordsmanship, and the second reason was that Lloyd was a delinquent. If he taught him the art of the sword, everyone around him would be in great danger. But our protagonist wanted to know if Javier's refusal was absolute, because if he taught him swordsmanship, Lloyd would help him cure the insomnia that had been bothering him for a while. Surprised, Javier wondered how he could possibly know that, since he hadn't told anyone yet. Lloyd knew because he had finished the novel, and he even knew the cause. In the novel, knights are divided into 4 grades: lower grade sword expert, intermediate sword expert, upper grade sword expert, sword master. Javier was about to advance from upper grade sword expert to sword master, and that made him very nervous, which is why he couldn't sleep. In this world, it's known as the sword master syndrome. Lloyd told him there was no need to pretend. Anyone could see he was suffering from insomnia. Javier sighed for a moment, then said fine, he would help him. Lloyd wanted to know if he was really going to help him. Javier said of course he would, because he was convinced Lloyd would fail without a doubt. A few minutes later, Javier had fallen asleep, half lying on a chair. Seeing him sleep, Lloyd told himself he already knew how Javier would cure his insomnia in the novel, and he had simply applied that knowledge. And now it was Javier's turn to teach him sword techniques, because Lloyd would learn them all and make them his. The sun rose, and after a good night's sleep, Javier had recovered all his strength. He told our protagonist to run 50 laps around the training grounds. Lloyd stared at him for a moment, then immediately started running. Javier wondered if he had really started running without complaining. After the first lap, Lloyd said he couldn't take it anymore and that Javier should teach him something else. After the second lap, Lloyd told him he thought he would give up, right? After the third lap, Lloyd told him he would probably stop teaching him, claiming he wasn't qualified, right? Javier felt attacked by those words, wondering how Lloyd had guessed his intentions so well. But Lloyd kept running, telling him he would continue until the 50th lap. While running, he thought about how difficult this body made physical exercise, but it was still much better than his old life, where he lived alone in a tiny studio, waking up every day just to survive. During the day, he worked on large construction sites, carrying bricks up to the 4th or 5th floor on his back. Then at night, he loaded and unloaded cargo trucks. Even when his hands were bleeding, he had to keep going. He had no choice. He kept telling himself that one day things would get better, but that day had never come, no matter how hard he worked. Compared to the pain he felt every day in his old life, this was nothing. Seeing him run with such determination, Javier decided to teach him his sword techniques if he was willing to work this hard for them. The system notified him that his sympathy level with Javier had increased by 1. Sympathy was now at -29. Because of that, he received 18 skill points, bringing his total to 29. Meanwhile, inside the manor, our protagonist's father wondered how Lloyd could be so rude to the man who had protected their family for over 5 generations. He thought Lloyd had changed because of his recent behavior, but apparently he had been wrong. He told Newman he couldn't cancel the duel, but he should go easy on him. He should simply teach him a lesson so he understands his mistake. Newman accepted his master's request, but inwardly he thought the duel would follow no rules. He planned to use the duel to cut off the insolent brat's head, and if the Baron tried to interfere, he would just eliminate them all and make it look like a suicide. After that, he would leave this little village as planned. 1 month later, the day of the duel arrived. Lloyd stood face to face with Newman in the training arena. His parents watched from the stands, accompanied by Javier and Bayern. Newman asked him if he was ready for the fight. Lloyd stepped forward with his shovel in hand. Our protagonist told him he was ready, not for the fight, but to teach him a good lesson. While our protagonist was standing face to face with his opponent, the people around couldn't tell if it was really a shovel that Lloyd was holding in his hands at that moment. And was he really going to fight the high-ranked knight Newman, armed with nothing but this shovel? But Lloyd was very confident, even with so many whispers behind his back. On the other hand, Newman was extremely angry, wondering to himself if this little thug was seriously planning to use a shovel against him. Watching from the stands, Javier thought that this was the very shovel Lloyd had asked the village blacksmith to make for him. Very sturdy, with a good solid handle. The Baron thought everything was already lost, because it seemed to him that Lloyd was taking this duel lightly, even though he was facing a very strong knight. He only hoped Lloyd had a backup plan. But Javier was not sure he had thought of any backup plan, because if he remembered correctly what he had seen over the past few weeks, for the first time since dawn, Lloyd had been training to increase his physical strength without complaining a single time. Then during the day, he did his best at the construction site, going everywhere to check the state of the work he supervised. Then in the evening, before going to sleep, the two of them trained in sword techniques without taking a single break. To him, this kind of behavior didn't belong to someone preparing a joke. The opposite. He knew he was more serious than usual. The Baron had just raised his hand to announce to the crowd that the duel between Lloyd and Newman could now begin. Newman got into his combat stance. Meanwhile, our protagonist also took a stance, but a rather embarrassing one. It even made Javier question where he had learned this stance from, because he had never practiced it in training. At that moment, Newman rushed toward our protagonist, asking him if he was trying to mock him. Lloyd stood ready, and with a single movement, he managed to deflect Newman's attack to the side, pushing his sword backward. The Baron was shocked to see him block an attack from Knight Newman. Javier was also surprised to see him use the shovel this way. Newman prepared to attack a second time, saying he wouldn't have the chance to block it again this time. But his attack was quickly blocked once more. Javier was shocked to see this scene, because the movement he used looked like an improved version of the training they had done that morning. Baron Newman didn't understand how this little nobody could block his attack so easily without having any combat experience. But our protagonist was thinking to himself that there was no need to be so surprised, because it was something he had learned during his military service. Immediately, he attacked after noticing an opening. Newman was surprised by this assault, but he instantly blocked Lloyd's attack. He attacked again, and Newman dodged it once more. After placing his shovel on the ground, our protagonist began provoking him to destabilize him. Seeing this, Javier wondered if everything he had done since the beginning of the duel was just a joke. But upon seeing Lloyd smile, he thought there must be a strategy behind it. Newman started attacking again. Lloyd took position, waiting firmly for him. He began pushing back all of Newman's assaults, forcing him to retreat even more. Newman didn't understand how someone known as a delinquent and a drunkard could repel his attacks like this. The system notified him that his tool mastery skill had just reached level 1. Any object he used now became one with him, increasing his physical strength. Because before this fight, when he was training with Javier, seeing how hard he worked, Javier had given him 1 skill point, then 2 and 3 points from the Baron and his wife, who for the first time saw their son working so hard to succeed. His total points were now 97, and he had used 40 points to acquire this tool mastery skill. This skill had helped him a lot when he was working, but during this fight against Newman, he was convinced he could win. But Newman had just sighed for a moment. Shaking his sword, he began making mana emanate from his body. Javier noticed Newman had decided to get serious because he started absorbing the surrounding mana and bringing it toward his heart. Lloyd noticed it too because he could clearly see the mana flow gathering around Newman's heart. After gripping his sword tightly with both hands, he made it clear to our protagonist that it was over for him now because he was going to fight seriously. In an instant, he suddenly advanced several meters toward Lloyd, preparing to cut him down with his sword. Seeing this, Javier thought it was impossible for our protagonist to block this attack because it takes at least 10 years for a normal person and 5 years for a knight to master heart mana, and with such intensity, it was the end for him. As the blade approached dangerously close to his head, he tightly grabbed his shovel, preparing to block Neumann's sword. But Neumann thought Lloyd was truly naive because now he was going to break the handle and strike him directly in the head. The Baron and his wife thought it was over for Lloyd, but he managed to block the attack with his shovel. Neumann couldn't believe it. How had he done something like that? But our protagonist was confident after this turn of events because he had already anticipated this scenario from the moment Neumann started gathering mana. And now he was going to use one of the techniques that made Javier so powerful in the novel, the Azrahan technique, a technique that allows you to absorb your opponent's mana once you're in physical or weapon contact. Neumann stepped back, telling him he had absorbed the mana from his attack, but Lloyd was already preparing his own attack, and with one well-placed hit to the face, Neumann was launched into the air, losing a few teeth in the process. But it wasn't over. Lloyd lifted his shovel upward and struck him hard on the head with it, making him fall to the ground completely defeated. The knights who were present couldn't believe it. How had he managed to bring Neumann down? Even the Baron was shocked, not really understanding what had just happened. People around wondered if Lloyd had really won, but others said it was impossible for someone like him to defeat a knight like Neumann. Still in shock, the Baron raised his hand, declaring Lloyd Frantera the winner of this battle. Neumann couldn't understand how he lost to this good-for-nothing Lloyd. Our protagonist then told him that he had won. Did he hear that? But unfortunately for him, he didn't care about the result. All he was going to do now was punish him for his insolence. But seeing him ready to strike, the Baron shouted at him to stop because the duel was already over. Lloyd had already begun hitting Neumann repeatedly with his shovel. Furious at the situation, the Baron shouted loudly at Lloyd to stop because Neumann was already on the ground. Seeing this, several soldiers came to calm him down so he would stop hitting him. In the stands, Bayan wondered if Lloyd, despite winning, had just lost his temper at that moment. But Javier told himself that Lloyd hadn't lost his temper at all. On the contrary, if you looked closely, you could clearly see that Lloyd was aiming at specific parts of Neumann's body when hitting him, and his face made it obvious he knew exactly where to strike, as if he already knew what would happen next, as if he already knew everything that was happening. Because 15 days before the duel, Lloyd had come to see him, asking him to teach him the Azrahan technique. Javier was surprised that he knew this technique, because it was a technique that allowed someone to absorb external mana to merge it with their own mana flow. Javier asked him where he had heard about it, since he himself hadn't spoken to anyone about it yet, as the technique was still being developed. But Lloyd told him that he talked about it in his sleep, so it was perfectly normal for him to have heard it at that moment. Javier thought he might be right, because he couldn't think of any other way Lloyd could have learned about this technique. He told him he couldn't teach it to him because it wasn't yet fully mastered, but Lloyd wanted to know if he could help perfect the technique, could he teach it to him then? Javier answered that if the technique was complete, then he would teach it to him. Lloyd then told him that instead of trying to combine his heart mana with the mana he absorbed from the outside, he should try a different approach. Instead of trying to merge the external mana with his own, he should focus on the mana swirling all around him and use it as it is, because that way it would be like his mana was being assisted by another, working together but separately. Javier said it sounded quite plausible and that he would try it, but he still wanted to know how Lloyd knew about this technique. He simply told him he had just imagined it on the spot, and if it worked, then it was already a good start, wasn't it? And that's how, for the first time, Javier managed to master the Ajrahan technique after a long period of refinement. On his first attempt, he managed to form 3 mana circles. He thought that with more training, he might succeed in creating 5 or 6 over time. After that, Lloyd asked Javier to teach him only the mana absorption part, because for now it was all he needed to defeat Newman. And of course, in front of all of them, he really did manage to defeat Knight Newman. But his father, furious at such actions, told him to stop immediately because he was disgracing his honor. Hearing this, Lloyd stopped hitting Newman, who was already lying on the ground. He told the Baron to check what was under the tablecloth before trying to defend that man any further. Lifting the tablecloth, several letters were hidden underneath. Reading one of the letters, the Baron was shocked by its contents. Lloyd told him those were letters Newman had exchanged with the man who had scammed him with the real estate contract. The Baron, still shocked by those letters, couldn't believe it, because there were explanations on how to forge fake real estate documents, and even information about their personal preferences. Newman, speechless, couldn't say a word, wondering internally how Lloyd had found those letters he had hidden inside the walls. Javier could only smile at the situation because in the novel, Javier was supposed to discover them much later after the Baron's death. The night before, he had asked Podong to retrieve them from inside the walls of Newman's room. The Baron, still in shock, couldn't believe what he was seeing because all these problems all this time had been caused by the man in front of him, the one he trusted. Seeing his state after reading the letters, our protagonist thought to himself that being kind didn't necessarily mean being a good ruler. He then told the Baron that he had a proposal to punish Newman for his actions. The Baron wanted to know how he intended to proceed. He told him by dropping a rat on his head, and if this rat injured him, he would immediately be expelled from their family. But if he wasn't injured, then he would simply be demoted to the rank of soldier. People in the crowd wondered why he was talking about a rat, because Mr. Newman couldn't possibly be hurt by a simple rat. The Baron was a bit surprised that such a suggestion came from his son, because he had proposed simple conditions that could easily be accepted, showing that anyone could be punished while still being given a chance to repent. Baron thought it was actually a brilliant idea that also served as a warning to others. The Baron told him that his proposal was accepted and he could proceed as he had described. Lloyd then asked Newman if he had any objections to the Baron's order. Newman said he was extremely grateful for the preferential treatment he had just been granted, but our protagonist told himself that when someone is given a second chance after committing a wrongdoing, he will take that kindness for granted and start doing even worse things. Internally, Newman told himself that he would take revenge on our protagonist and his father. After all this, they would pay with their lives. He was interrupted from his thoughts by Lloyd, who told him that the smile he was showing at that moment would be his last if he didn't know it already. Newman didn't understand what he was talking about, but Lloyd had just given a red sunflower seed to Podong. After that, he threw him into the air, telling Newman there was no way he would be forgiven. Once the seed was eaten, Podong began to grow in size. The Baron and his wife couldn't believe what they were seeing. The same reaction was shared by Javier and Baron. People in the crowd couldn't believe it, asking themselves what exactly that thing was. Was it a summon or just a normal hamster? Seeing Podong begin to descend, Lloyd took off running, leaving Newman alone to face his miserable fate. Seeing the size of what was coming toward him, he couldn't believe it. How could a hamster that big even exist? Podong, falling at great speed, finally crashed right on top of Newman, causing a huge explosion behind our protagonist, who was visibly satisfied with the turn of events. Podong had completely crushed him under his weight, and seeing that, Lloyd raised his finger in the air as a sign of victory, because he had just eliminated the source of his family's problems. A few days later, after the events had unfolded, in a corner of the village, Podong was digging into the ground. Lloyd and Javier were standing nearby, watching him work. Javier wanted to know what Podong was doing, digging like that. Our protagonist told him he was preparing the ground for the construction of a road, because now that their soldiers, who used to be exhausted like old men, had become brave and powerful warriors, they were going to take advantage of that and speed up the construction work. After all, if he remembered correctly, In ancient times, the Romans had a tendency to build magnificent roads, and he intended to do the same in this world. The road they were building right now would start from the Baron's residence and stretch all the way to the foot of the eastern mountain. Javier wondered why such a long distance. Lloyd simply told him to wait. He would see the final result for himself. Javier seemed a bit confused by those words, unable to understand why it was so necessary. But our protagonist told him that the purpose of this project was much greater, because it would serve to increase the value of their fief. Curious, Javier wanted to know how Lloyd even knew such things, since he had been building houses no one had ever seen here, and recently had even summoned a high-ranked creature. A bit suspicious, he wanted to know if he was still the same Lloyd he had known until now. But at that moment, the system notified him that Javier had suddenly grown wary of him. Deep inside, he had expected this. In the novel, Javier was exactly this type of person, and if he learned that Lloyd wasn't the real Lloyd, he might even draw his sword and execute him on the spot. To avoid creating trouble, he told him that he simply studied in secret. Was that really a problem? Javier didn't understand. How could he study in secret when they were almost always together? What about when he slept or when he went to relieve himself? Even if he wasn't always by his side, how could he explain that summoning from the other day? Even a magician with 20 years of experience would struggle to accomplish that. Annoyed, Lloyd asked him in return how he could fight so well and master mana so efficiently at only 20 years old. But Javier told him that wasn't the point. Still, Lloyd wanted to know why he had the right to be a genius, but Lloyd didn't. Javier had no answer because Lloyd was right. Our protagonist turned around and started walking away, leaving Javier deep in thought behind him. After walking a few steps, he ran into Mr. Bayern. He told him he would be away for a while and was leaving the supervision of the construction to him. Bayern said he would do his best and wished him a good trip. From behind, Javier said he would accompany him to ensure his protection. Lloyd told him it was obvious he would come with him. Javier then asked where he planned to go now. Our protagonist said it was a bit far. He was going to retrieve all the money that had been stolen from them. Javier wondered what money he was talking about. No rumor about stolen funds had been reported. As the sun set over a small nearby village, inside an inn, a hand slammed onto a table. The man sitting there was Tordes the swindler, who had collaborated with Newman to scam Lloyd's father. Clearly upset after losing a large sum of money, he wondered if he had been scammed in return. But his butler told him that's how casinos worked. He made money off them as well, so it was normal that he lost sometimes. The butler also warned that if Tordes had no more money, he would stop escorting him to avoid problems when payment time came. Terrified, Tordes claimed he still had money and told him not to worry. But the butler simply told him to honor his part of the deal and everything would be fine. Tordes wondered where he would get more money since many people were searching for him and he had to stay hidden. At that moment, our protagonist entered the room. Tordes, startled by his sudden appearance, asked who he was. Our protagonist realized they had never met face to face before. He told him his name was Lloyd Frontera and asked if that name rang a bell. Hearing this, Tordes nearly dropped dead on the spot. His butler asked whether he should get rid of Lloyd immediately, but Tordes told him they needed to escape as fast as possible. The man grabbed him and jumped out the window with him, landing gracefully in an alley behind the inn. But something caught his attention. Right in front of them, a man holding a sword was waiting, ready to attack. As he stepped forward, Javier told the butler to hand over the criminal, otherwise he would be considered his accomplice. Javier had to admit everything was happening exactly as Lloyd had predicted. Lloyd had even said they would try escaping through the back window of the inn. Irritated by these words, the butler began preparing a magical attack, clearly dark magic. Our protagonist, watching from above through the window, realized this was the exact same mage Javier had fought in the novel, and he had lost back then. It was his first time fighting a dark mage. But now, Javier was no longer as weak as he had been in the story. The mage finished forming his sphere of dark energy and launched it at Javier, who simply stared for a moment without moving. Then he blocked it with his sword. When it exploded, a magical barrier appeared around Javier. The mage mocked him and tightened his fist. Javier struggled to resist the gravity spell with all his strength. The mage was shocked to see such a young man withstand his magic. This spell could no longer affect Javier because, thanks to Lloyd, Javier was now able to generate 3 mana circles around his heart. With a simple sword strike, he shattered the spell, asking the mage if that was all he could do. Seeing his magic fail, the mage instantly took off, telling Tortoise their contract was now void. Tortoise begged him not to leave him alone. Javier slowly approached him with his sword. Seeing this, Tortoise was terrified, stumbling backward until he hit the wall. Javier raised his sword and told him he would cut his legs and drag him to court on all fours. As the blade got dangerously close, Lloyd suddenly appeared in front of him, telling him to stop, because if they brought Tortoise before the court, he would be executed immediately for his crimes. Javier was surprised to see Lloyd worrying for this man despite everything he had done. A few hours later, after these events, during the night, Tordes was sitting on a chair, tied up and panicking. In front of him stood our protagonist and Javier, who didn't really understand why he kept trembling so much. Lloyd spoke first and told him to calm down, because there was no reason for him to feel uncomfortable in front of them. He understood him perfectly. Sometimes a man can become greedy for money. Tordes stared at him for a moment. He wanted to know if Lloyd had forgiven him and wasn't going to send him to prison. Lloyd told him that was exactly the case. There was no need to take him to court just for this. All he needed to do was return all the Baron's fortune he had extorted until now. Tordes said he would gladly return it if it meant he would be forgiven. But Lloyd told him that the money belonged to him by right, so there was no need for forgiveness just because he was returning what wasn't his. Pulling a piece of paper from his pocket, Lloyd told him he needed to do something for him before being forgiven. Immediately, Tordes said he would do anything Lloyd asked of him, of course. Sliding a folder across the table, Lloyd told him that if he signed this document, then he might consider forgiving him. Tordes wanted to know what kind of contract it was. Our protagonist told him it was a simple work contract and he would be paid for it, but 80% of his salary would be seized to repay his debt at every payment. He only needed to work 520 years to pay everything back. Shocked, Tordes couldn't believe what he had just heard. Javier was also stunned. He couldn't believe Lloyd had pronounced such a cruel sentence. But Lloyd thought to himself that he wouldn't let a man who owed them money die so easily when he needed manpower for his construction projects. Tordes said he had never seen such an unfair contract in his entire life, but our protagonist wanted to know why he said such things when he was the one who started by scamming them first. If he didn't agree, they could simply go face the judge. Hearing this, Tordes burst into tears, already bitterly regretting everything as he began signing the contract. Early the next morning, at sunrise, the 3 men were in a carriage on their way back to the Frontera barony. Javier wanted to know if, with the money they had just recovered, they would pay most of their debts. Lloyd told him he was going to use it to pay the labor force instead, because their soldiers weren't enough for the task. He wondered to himself if people would even agree to work for him, given the delinquent reputation attached to his name. A few days later, in the Frontera barony, a recruitment announcement had been posted. Many villagers were lined up to get their work contracts. Lloyd was surprised to see so many people when everyone supposedly hated him. Javier told him that used to be the case, but now people saw him differently, because he sold ondels at low prices, then punished the man who betrayed the Baron, and recently had even summoned a magical creature. Now, to the villagers, he was seen as reliable and very talented. Lloyd was shocked that their opinion of him had changed just because of those few things. He was interrupted by a man asking for his work contract. Lloyd asked him to wait a moment. The man also thanked him, saying that thanks to the ondels, he and his family no longer had to worry about the winter cold, and that he was very grateful. Lloyd was a bit shocked. He had done it simply to satisfy his own needs. He hadn't expected such reactions. The man added that he had a brother in the neighboring village and asked if he could also order an ondel from him. Lloyd was delighted. That was the first step of his plan. For people farther away, he would raise the prices and include transportation fees, and that way he would make a lot of money. Javier, standing next to him, wondered why he had that delinquent smile on his face again. He also wondered what the purpose of that long road toward the mountain was, because that day, Lloyd had explained that sooner or later, all the trees would disappear since an ondel consumes a lot of wood, and those trees would eventually be cut down. Javier had asked him if he had built all those ondels while already foreseeing this outcome. Lloyd told him that was exactly why he wanted to build a road leading to the mountain, because once they got there, they would extract blazing coal from the mine located there. They would then sell this coal at a good price and make some profit. Hearing this, Javier was really annoyed, but Lloyd told him to calm down. They would offer discounts only to the people of their village. Turning to Javier, he asked him if he thought he was being sly. He said he had to do things this way, or else their village would continue falling deeper into debt. Javier told him he agreed for now, but the Baron didn't know there was coal in that mine, and the previous barons had already tried many times without success. But our protagonist told him he already knew all those little details, and he was certain he could do it, because he had a modern technique called the shield technique. Javier thought, another technique I'd never heard of. But he had to trust him because Lloyd's projects were gradually improving their financial situation. Meanwhile, at the foot of the mountain, at the entrance of the tunnel, several glowing eyes were visible in the darkness, a colony of gigantic ants moving together. Meanwhile, our protagonist was sitting at the table, working while feeling extremely tired. He was printing a construction blueprint on paper, and the system had just notified him that he had successfully upgraded blueprint printing to level 1. He also thought that it would be nice if he too could summon undead workers so they could work without needing to be paid. He immediately went back to work since he had no time to waste complaining, because after the Newman incident, he had managed to earn many relationship points, which he then invested into his skill points, specifically basic design and basic measurement. And once both skills reached level 10, they evolved into intermediate design and intermediate measurement, granting him 2 new skills, land value estimation and underground scanning, as well as blueprint visualization and blueprint printing. Late that evening, he went to the mine, thinking he would have to dig his way in since the entrance was now closed off. He activated his underground scanning skill to get a sense of what might be inside the mine. With this skill, he could see up to 5 meters ahead and could easily find the best path to take. But the biggest problem was the digging, because the workers would get exhausted very quickly. Podong couldn't help either. He had already worked too hard lately and needed to recover his strength. There was only one solution left: summon another creature. The system informed him that a summon draw would cost 70 points, and he currently had 119 points. Lloyd confirmed the draw, sitting and waiting while the system activated in front of him. A magical creature began emerging from the summoning circle, smiling as its head appeared. Then it immediately fell to the ground. The creature introduced itself to our protagonist as Bengal, but Lloyd wondered what kind of creature it even was. He then asked if she could also evolve by being fed a sunflower seed. Bengal nodded, confirming that was exactly the case. He wanted to know if she had her own skills as well. She nodded again. Could she show him what she could do? Overjoyed, Bengal was excited to demonstrate her abilities. A few weeks later, after these events, we find Bengal digging through the earth with her mouth. Bengal's skill was earth biting. Lloyd shouted to Javier to get ready, because Bengal's second skill was accelerated earth digestion. Javier stood ready with his sword in hand. Bengal transformed the digested earth into steel bars that shot at high speed toward Javier. In an instant, Javier cut all of them into equal lengths. After slicing the steel bars, the blacksmiths behind them immediately began forging segments that would support the weight of the mine from the inside. It was no time to relax. They still had to go deeper into the mine. While the workers moved forward, Lloyd felt the low oxygen underground making him dizzy, and if he hadn't installed a ventilation pipe, they would all be suffocating already. While he was thinking, his thoughts were interrupted by Javier arriving behind him. Javier told him he should also step outside to rest with the other workers. Turning around, our protagonist told him he didn't have that right, because the site manager must stay on location until the end. When he lived in the other world, the managers of the construction sites he worked on almost never showed up at the site. Activating his underground scanning skill again, he spotted the coal ore just ahead, only a few meters deeper in the rock. Seeing this, he raised his arm and shouted that they were almost there, and all the workers cheered at the news. With Bengal sitting on his shoulders, he felt proud of her, Thanks to her, they had progressed so quickly through the work. He then informed his entire team that once they extracted all the coal in this rock, they would expand the mine to exploit it better. Of course, it was still dangerous work, so they had to be extremely careful. But at that moment, a noise came from behind them. Lloyd turned around abruptly after hearing it, wondering what it was. The noise grew louder and closer, sending chills down our protagonist's spine. He didn't understand. The ground was still solid, so why was there noise? It was impossible for the earth to collapse suddenly. Activating the underground scanning skill again, he could now see that there was blazing coal in the rock, but also a hole that had just been dug. A hole that hadn't been there moments ago, and the hole was growing larger. In an instant, a gigantic ant burst through the rock, charging straight at Lloyd. Javier, behind him, already had his hand on his sword. As our protagonist fell to the ground, Javier firmly gripped his sword, determined, and with a single strike, cut off the ant's pincers. Getting back up with his shovel, Lloyd struck the ant's head with a powerful blow, killing it instantly. After this attack, he thought about how badly it had frightened him, and Bangle on his shoulders was trembling in fear. But Lloyd didn't understand. In the novel, there was no mention of ants. It was very worrying since ants usually live in colonies and move in groups. Several ants began emerging from underground, rushing toward the surface at high speed. Seeing this, Lloyd ordered all workers to immediately evacuate the cave. Everyone complied in panic, running to the exit. Javier stayed behind, fighting the ants pouring out of the hole, trying to buy time for the workers to escape. Our protagonist wondered how many ants might come out, because if there were more than 200, the entire village would be destroyed. And could Javier fight all of them? Impossible. There was too little oxygen underground. The workers managed to escape, leaving Javier and Lloyd inside the cave. Javier slapped Lloyd across the face, telling him to get a grip and not panic. But Lloyd, annoyed, said he was thinking, not panicking. Javier told him he wouldn't hold out much longer at this rate against the ants. But our protagonist really didn't know what to do, until suddenly an idea came to him. Grabbing a burning torch, he told Javier they had to go deep into the ant's nest. But Javier thought this was insane. No matter how many they killed, the ants kept coming in groups. The two men had no choice left. They ran forward, deeper into the nest, determined and with no other option. Meanwhile, a man had come to bring the news of the ant attack to the Baron. He was very surprised, wondering how wild ants could have ended up in the cave. And what about Lloyd? He evacuated all the workers first and stayed inside the mine with Javier, the guard replied. But the father of our protagonist was not convinced by this news. He opened the wardrobe to take out his armor. Once he had put it on, he told the guard to take him to the site immediately. Javier was trying his best to defend himself against the ants. He wanted to know how far they still needed to go inside the cave. But Lloyd told him to stop stressing him out because he was trying to think of a way to escape. And on top of that, they were surrounded by several ants. The only advantage was that the ants hadn't immediately moved toward the exit of the mine, but it was still very annoying to fight all of them here. Even for Javier, it was very difficult because of the restricted movement and the lack of oxygen as well. He had to find a solution fast, or they wouldn't last long at this rate. And since they were in a coal mine, it also meant bacteria producing methane were present in that area. If he could find even a small pocket of it and apply some fire, they could get rid of all these ants once and for all. After activating his underground scanning skill, he had detected a thin layer of methane right beneath their feet in front of Javier. After stabbing his shovel into the ground, Javier wondered what he was doing in a moment like this with his shovel. But our protagonist told him to cover him because he was digging. He had just gotten an idea. Lloyd started digging at great speed, but at the same moment an ant suddenly burst out right in front of him. Seeing this, Javier immediately turned around, and in a fraction of a second, he sliced the ant in half. He continued attacking the other ants behind them, but then a deafening noise made them both stop, wondering what was causing it. But he didn't even have time to finish his sentence, because right in front of them stood a gigantic ant. Seeing this, Javier grabbed his sword tightly out of fear. Lloyd, however, wondered if it was normal for an ant to be that big. Was that the queen? The massive creature began moving forward toward the two men, still shocked by the situation. Our protagonist wanted to know if Javier could handle such a creature in his condition, but he replied no, because the conditions weren't favorable for them to win. But he should at least try before saying that. But Javier told him it was pointless to try because they were already too exhausted to face it. Still, they had no choice, otherwise they would die either under the creature's legs or from lack of oxygen. The ant was dangerously approaching both of them. Then Javier made 3 mana circles float around his heart. With his feet firmly planted on the ground, he focused all his strength into his sword, managing to block the creature's first attack. Even the ant was surprised to see its attack stopped by such a small creature. But Javier, fully concentrated, hanging on despite the immense force, managed to push the creature backward. Meanwhile, Lloyd was digging behind them, telling himself Javier couldn't hold on much longer at this pace. He had to hurry. His shovel then struck something solid. Seeing this, Lloyd shouted to Javier to run immediately toward the exit of the mine. As he prepared to grab the burning piece of wood, both men started running toward the exit, the creature chasing them from behind. The exit was right ahead, and once they were out of the Queen's tunnel, Lloyd jumped and immediately turned around mid-air, throwing the burning stick with all his strength into the back of the tunnel. It landed on the creature, passed behind it, and dropped inside the nest. Just as the creature was about to finish him, the gas inside the cave came into contact with the fire, causing a massive explosion, eliminating the Ant Queen in the process. Seeing the danger approaching, Javier threw his body forward to protect Lloyd. The explosion spread little by little through the inside of the cave, burning all the ants around. Lloyd's father arrived at that exact moment in front of the mine, and hearing the explosion, he started worrying for his son. But Byron did his best to hold him back from going inside. Meanwhile, Javier took the full impact of the explosion trying to protect Lloyd. As Lloyd slowly stood up, he realized his plan had worked. They had defeated the Ant Queen. But Javier and Bengal were now completely exhausted after the explosion, yet Lloyd also realized something even worse had happened. The exit was now blocked after the explosion. Slowly getting up and nearly fainting from lack of oxygen, he activated his underground scanning skill with great difficulty, because they would all die if they stayed there too long, and he would need to dig more than 5 meters to reach the other side of the cave. The system notified him that his oxygen level was very low, but our protagonist had no choice. He had to dig. Exhausted and barely conscious, Javier managed to see him digging, mumbling that he had to get everyone out because he was responsible for all of them. Before he lost consciousness, the system informed Lloyd that Javier had been affected by the effort, and he earned 6 points. He also gained 108 relationship points, bringing his total to 157. As his breathing became more and more difficult, the system kept informing him of his current condition and remaining oxygen. Determined, our protagonist asked the system to find a skill he could develop to escape this situation by using his relationship points. After making this request, the system began analyzing his current skills to determine which skill could help him in this moment. Knowledge detected, absorption of surrounding mana, transformation of absorbed mana, and amplification of absorbed mana. He could now use the Ashrahan technique as a unique skill, and all of this made sense because ever since the confrontation with Newman, whenever he had free time, he practiced it, and everything he had learned would now serve as skills. After clicking on the notification, mana began emanating from him. Mana circles began forming around his heart, and the mana amplification skill boosted him to 120%. But our protagonist thought that for now, the skills he possessed were progressing slowly. However, thanks to his relationship points, he was able to increase his level in the blink of an eye. He then clicked on the advanced level Ashrahan skill, which cost 10 skill points. The Ashrahan technique rose to level 6, and his mana was now much more substantial than before. After amplifying his mana to 125% once again, he realized that each time he needed 5 more points to level up, and after clicking again, a notification appeared saying that the Ashrahan technique had now reached level 7. Seeing this, Lloyd began repeatedly pressing the increase button, raising his level again and again. Suddenly, a notification appeared, making him stop for a moment. He had just leveled up and changed rank at the same time. 2 mana circles manifested around his heart, and he had acquired the Ashrahan double circle technique at level 1. His mana was now amplified to 200%, and he now needed 100 skill points to level up. His remaining total points were 7. He then asked the system if there were other skills he had acquired, since he had also improved his measuring and crafting skills. He had acquired the optional skill, Energizing, allowing him to move without getting tired for 10 minutes, with a daily usage limit of once per day. Optional skill 2, Explosion of Latent Power, which could now triple his mana for 20 seconds, also limited to once per day. Seeing this, Lloyd was more motivated than ever. After activating his Energizing skill, his body overflowed with energy. Shovel in hand, he began digging with more strength and speed. With scanning active, he could already see how far he needed to dig, because he only needed a small opening to let air enter where they were. Moving at great speed, faster and faster, his oxygen was almost gone. Trembling, he told himself he wasn't far, he just needed a little more effort. As he dug with all his strength, behind him, his familiar and Javier lay unconscious on the ground. Determined, as he tried to dig again, suddenly he fell to his knees, letting his shovel drop, almost unconscious as he stared at the ground before him. His Energizing skill had reached its limit of 10 minutes. He fell to his knees, powerless in front of the massive work he had done, but without success. And just as everything seemed lost, he activated his Explosion of Latent Power skill. Suddenly, he began to rise, grabbing his shovel, and started digging again with the last strength he had left. With only 30 centimeters left before breaking through, our protagonist collapsed to the ground, losing all hope and suffocating from lack of oxygen. His strength was slipping away little by little. Closing his eyes, everything seemed lost for Lloyd, because no one could come save him now. But a noise woke him. He slowly tried to get up to see where the sound was coming from. At that moment, Podong appeared after managing to open a small gap. Seeing him, Lloyd was shocked and overjoyed, because fresh air entered the cave again. With a bit of strength recovered, he slowly stood up, leaning on his shovel. Meanwhile, outside, it was already night. The Baron and several soldiers entered the cave. Baron told him it was too dangerous to go deeper and that he should wait a moment. But the Baron told them not to worry about him because he would go all the way into the cave. But something in the distance caught his attention. He stopped to look closely, and it was Lloyd, carrying Javier on his back and walking with difficulty. The system informed our protagonist that he had surpassed his limits by activating techniques in such a dangerous situation. He had acquired a new skill, Energy Saving Mode. This now allowed him to keep the Ashrahan technique active at all times, even when extremely exhausted. After dropping his lamp on the ground, the Baron began running toward our protagonist, who finally collapsed into his arms with Javier on his back. After these events, the night passed, and when the sun rose, the villagers' opinion of him had changed after learning what had happened in the coal mine that evening. Some of them had been unfortunate enough to be trapped deep inside with the ants, but thanks to Lloyd, who got them all out, they were still alive. All the villagers agreed that Lloyd had changed completely because he was no longer the troublemaker they all knew before. Meanwhile, in the manor, Lloyd was lying in bed while Javier sat beside him. Still asleep, he finally opened his eyes. Seeing him awaken, Javier was very surprised. The system informed him that all the villagers were talking positively about him, and because of that incredible feat, many bonus points were awarded to him. His remaining points were 7, but suddenly they were now 507. Seeing this, Lloyd was a bit shocked to have earned so many points at once. But to him, the most important thing was the 500 points. The rest didn't matter at all. Your support means everything. If you enjoyed this recap, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any of the next episodes. Every interaction helps the channel grow more and more. Thank you for your time, your energy, and your loyalty. What did you think of this story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. See you soon for another incredible episode.